About 50 years and 1 month ago, King George V came to Belfast to set up a parliament and a system of government. 50 years later, citizen is separated from citizen by barbed wire and lines of soldiers on the streets of Belfast. Can there be any greater evidence of the failure of a system of government?
John Hume MP once fought for reform of the Ulster government. Now he wants it overthrown. He's a measure of what's happened to the moderates in Northern Ireland. This weekend in Londonderry, John Hume launched a campaign of civil disobedience led by him and the other Catholic opposition MPs in Northern Ireland. The meeting was in Hume's own constituency of the Bogside, the city's Catholic heartland, where clashes and gunfights with the British Army had been going on for much of the week. And Hume himself had been arrested by the army. A protest meeting hardly seemed the way to cool tempers. What do you hope to achieve by this meeting today?
Well, the purpose of the meeting is to explain to the people our programme of civil disobedience and passive resistance, and to show very clearly to those in authority that the action of withdrawal of consent from the present system of government in Northern Ireland is not the action of a few agitators, but is representative of a whole people.
Has there been a public meeting in Derry in the past 2 years which hasn't ended in some sort of violence?
There has been no outdoor public meeting which hasn't ended in some sort of violence. And I realise that in calling this meeting, you know, certain risks are involved, but it has to be done at this stage. Either we gather the people together into a campaign of passive resistance, or we stood aside and watched violence destroy us all. I have taken a step.
But this, you're taking a deliberate risk here, because you have been criticised that by calling a meeting of this sort with an explosive situation on your hands, that this could in fact make the situation worse, lead to more violent
Well, the answer to
conflict.
that is that there was violence anyway going on, and that violence can only escalate and increase. We could stand aside from that and keep making statements about it while people got destroyed. That's one choice we had. The only other choice was to stand up and lead in a direction of passive resistance, and that's precisely what we're doing, and we're determined.
Hume and the other opposition MPs have already withdrawn from the Ulster Parliament at Stormont. Now they want their followers to bring it down by non-violent action through civil disobedience. Their weapon is the non-payment of rent and rates on all council houses. John Hume sees the campaign as a way of getting violence off the streets and getting the mass of Catholics caught up in practical protest.
Pay their money, their rent to an agent.
Yes.
But the houses have since been taken over by the Commission. What exactly is the position?
The exact
of that?
position is that they do not pay any rent to any public authority, and the Commission is a public authority, so they pay no rent to the Commission as a public authority.
There was a poetic start to the rent strike meeting.
We'd rather live in a tent!
We won't pay the rent!
We're giving it up for Lent!
We won't pay the rent!
It's time the army went!
We won't pay the rent!
Ian Paisley is bent!
We won't pay the rent!
We will never relent!
We won't pay the rent!
We'll demolish Stormont!
We won't pay the rent!
They can do what we like, they won't break the strike till they end internment! We won't break the rent! We won't break the rent! We won't pay the rent!
Hume himself seemed embarrassed by the poet. He called for passive resistance to accompany the rent strike.
We can react in anger, and our anger is just. But we must look to where our anger and the actions that arise from it are leading us. When we first took to the streets, we went there with our bare hands. We were beaten off the streets, and the world came to our side because it was very clear that we were not aggressors, that we were in fact a defenseless people with a just cause, and the world came to our side, and the pressure of world opinion forced the change. we are now in an even more serious situation, where we're not facing policemen with bats, we are facing an army with guns. There is only one way, and it is a very powerful way, that we can defeat that army. And we can defeat them totally. And having defeated the army, it will be then clear to everyone that there isn't no military solution to this problem. That method of defeating them is total passive resistance. If we are engaged in a confrontation situation with soldiers, there is no point in throwing stones or petrol bombs or shooting at them, but there is plenty of point in sitting down and saying, throw your water, throw your gas, shoot your rubber bullets, shoot even your lead bullets, but we shall not be moved.
There were worries about what would happen after the meeting, but Hume's decision to hold it in a football ground, not the street, paid off. The bogsiders were quieter than a normal football crowd. Wisely, the army were nowhere to be seen.
And I'm running.
But the barricades breed a gratuitous violence, which can often spark off a confrontation with the army. The only incident after the meeting was almost on Hume's doorstep and led to nothing.
When did you get out of hospital, Jerry?
I was released last night about 5:45, you know.
John Hume was born in the bogside and still lives there. He can hardly insulate himself from the place. A constituent claims he was beaten up by the army for no reason. And there's always someone coming round with a problem. MPs of both sides in Northern Ireland are embattled men, far removed from the salon politics of Westminster or Dublin.
How'd you be?
I do.
Well,
yeah.
Cheerio, Jerry, good luck.
See you again. Right, thanks very much. Cheerio.
Even inside the house, there's no getting away from the reality of the conflict. Looming over it is one of the army's observation posts for the bogside. In his garden, Hume talked about the problems of non-violence and moderation in Ulster today.
You've always been looked upon as a moderate, and yet as I see it now, your position is that you just don't accept the government of Northern Ireland anymore. And that seems a very immoderate position, and in fact an extremist position. Are there any real moderates left in Northern Ireland?
Well, it depends what you mean by moderate. Moderate is a relative term. And in the situation in which we are in Northern Ireland at the present time, we are in a very extreme situation. Then, in fact, if one is to hold a peaceful position, which is paramount, I believe, overriding all things in this question, then one must respond with extreme non-violent measures, because we are in a desperate situation here at the present time.
If violence has worked, if violence has led to change, there must be pressure on you, and you must be very aware of the possibility of losing ground to the IRA.
Well, I think the mistake that the people who say violence has worked have made is that violence has worked when it has been committed against us, and therefore the violence committed against us has won sympathy for our cause. And the violence against us in August '69, when 500 families in Falls Road were burned out of their homes and 9 people were shot, the violence committed against the civil rights movement, this was the sort of violence which in fact won public sympathy for us and created the pressures on the British government. And people who promote violence simply say, well, violence worked, but they don't take the trouble to explain what sort of violence worked.
You condemn absolutely the provisional IRA.
I have absolutely no time for violence in any description which is aimed at achieving political ends, particularly in this society where violence can only eventually lead to a sectarian war.
1968, the Catholic civil rights movement begins. One man, one vote, a fairer deal for Catholics in housing and jobs were its aims. But this non-violent movement was soon in the midst of violence. Protestant fears were aroused. The gap between Catholic and Protestant began to widen. The police made no secret of where their sympathies lay.
God save us all!
Along with police brutality there were also extremists on the Catholic side who wanted to provoke a confrontation. Moderates like Hume found it hard to control the situation.
Gentlemen, I appeal to you to march across that way now. That way.
As civil rights marches continued into 1969, the violence got worse. The Unionist government was reluctant to make concessions to the minority. The Catholics insisted on reform. Finally, in August 1969, the Apprentice Boys' March in Londonderry, celebrating the Protestant victory over the Catholics 3 centuries ago, provoked a new outbreak of violence. The Catholics were not to be moved. The Protestants would not yield. Both sides took to the streets in a riot that spilled over into Belfast and set Ulster ablaze. For a year, the moderates in the civil rights movement had pressed for reform. But now it was the time for the extremists on both sides to take to the streets. John Hume was always the man who urged the peaceful way, but now he was caught in the crossfire of the old hatreds of Catholics and Protestants. Albert Anderson, Unionist MP for Derry City, regards himself as a moderate. His view of John Hume is typical of Protestant reaction.
I've never regarded him as a moderate. I reckon he's the brains behind most of this. He keeps in the background. He makes the ammunition for other people to fire, like Mr. Cooper, and he keeps the whole pot boiling.
Do you think then that his actions are having a violent consequence, even though the campaign is civil disobedience and passive resistance, non-violent aims?
Well, let me put it like this. 3 or 4 years ago here, there was every sign that Protestant and Roman Catholics were making an effort to get on well together. They were meeting far more than they'd ever done before. They were joining in social things in a way they'd never done before. They were joining in public things in the way they'd never done before. When the civil rights campaign started, and in a night or in a week, all that went to the wind. It wasn't the fault of the Protestants or Unionists. I don't think it was the fault even of a lot of Roman Catholics, maybe the majority of Roman Catholics, but they were forced to do it and forced to join in, just as many of them are now being forced to join in this civil disobedience, many who have no wish whatever to do it, but if they don't, they're intimidated and their lives are made a hell.
Last week in the Bogside, the army moved in to clear away the barricades. Attacks on the troops and gun battles followed. As the barricades were bulldozed away, so the Bogsiders built them up again. John Hume led a sit-down protest in an attempt to get away from street violence and back to the old passive resistance of the civil rights days. He was sprayed with purple dye and arrested for failing to move on command of the army. On Monday, Hume's case was heard at the courthouse in Londonderry. The maximum penalty was 2 years in prison or £100 fine, and the Bogside waited anxiously to see what would happen to their MP. But the case was adjourned to September, and the tension among the Catholics was lowered.
We're now going along to the heart of the of the bogside itself. And this area is known as Free Derry Corner, and this is Free Derry Row. And this is where my own people come from. My grandparents lived in that house there.
That's burnt, well, it's due for demolition.
Yeah,
now,
and my mother was born there and grew up there, and my aunts still live in this row. So the bogside is more or less in my blood, and I can remember my grandfather. The unchanging nature of this problem is easily seen. I remember my grandfather as a boy coming out and putting the shutters in the windows every night, and I remember asking him why he did it, and it dated back to the riots of the 1920s, when riots in these streets took place, and they put shutters in the windows to protect the windows. And this has been a recurring thing in every generation. And
these were Protestant Catholic clashes, were they?
No, there were riots between Catholics and the forces of law and order, and of the forces of the state. And indeed, it has happened every generation, and to read the papers and the stories of this, it doesn't seem to change. So if it's not changed this time, if there's not a radical political change this time, all that we're doing is we're building up the same again for another generation.
These barricades, I mean, have people got used to living with barricades? I mean, why are these barricades here now?
Well, these barricades have been put up in this area, and they've been up here for some weeks now, and the army took them down twice. They were put up again twice. It's more or less the people of the area expressing their opposition to the system and their resistance to it, and trying to prove that they do not accept the system of government here, and that is, and keeping the campaign of civil disobedience is saying precisely the same thing.
Don't you think it's justified that the British government, the British Army, should be taking down these barricades, though, to get the city back to normal? I mean, they can't really tolerate barricades all over the place, can they?
The situation is, of course, that at the present time, that there is no role left for the British Army here. They've been put in an impossible position, the British Army, and that there isn't a military solution to it.
Doesn't the fact that this Craig and this new estate up here have something like 82 barricades, I mean, doesn't that induce lawlessness or induce a sense of creating disorder?
Well, it's funny that you should say that about Craigan Estate. It's one of the largest housing estates in Northern Ireland, and yet it doesn't even have a police station. It has never had a police station, because the crime rate here in Derry has been one of the lowest in these islands. And that is, in the past, the police themselves have said this, and in the past they've said that there never was a necessity for a police station here because of the fact that the people are basically and fundamentally law-abiding.
Well, look, we've just had a stone thrown at the car there. Do you think these children now have got used to a state of lawlessness, and indeed represent, you know, the element that do throw stones at the army, whatever they're doing? I mean, that they're just now in a state where they've got used to this type of life.
The real problem is that people will not cooperate with the forces of law and order because they've no respect for them. If this sort of violence that has happened in this society were going on in Birmingham or some other British city, it wouldn't last a week, because the people there have respect for and cooperate with the forces of law and order.
Would you accept that there is a hooligan element in all this, and that there is a sheer troublemaking element without any political motives that you might have?
Well, I accept that in every society there's a small minority of people who break the law. That's true everywhere. But I think that to try and say that the protest in this area is entirely the protest of a hooligan element is hardly in accord with the evidence.
Do you ever think what effect the replaying of scenes of violence in Belfast and Derry has on the British people? Do you ever think that, in fact, they might think, oh, we're fed up with that lot. They're at it again. They're stoning British troops. They're killing British troops.
Yeah.
Does that play on your mind?
It does. I think that's a normal and natural reaction for people in Britain, particularly those who have got their sons serving in the army over here, and particularly areas of Britain who have regiments over here and who know the men who are over serving. That's a completely natural reaction. But I think that they should ask themselves, really, why is their army being put in such an impossible position when the very leaders of the army say that there's no military solution to the problem, that there has to be a political solution?
The rent strike is now the method Hume sees as forcing the Ulster and the British governments to a political solution. It was originally called to protest against internment, but the aim is to end the Stormont government. Amongst the Catholics of Derry, I found the strike solid.
Hello. Are you on rent strike here?
We are. Well, we think a rent strike is a good idea.
Why?
Because, you know, for some reason, nobody's taking any notice of us. If we're out fighting, nobody's noticing us. But this rent strike will put the pressure on.
What will happen if, in fact, they start trying to evict people after not paying their rents?
You have no chance. I'll be an open warfare. I'll be for a while, I'll be out.
Do you believe in non-violence? Do you believe it can work?
No. We've seen too much blood and no inquiries without having it to work.
So you don't think, in fact, that John Hume's non-violent campaign will work?
I think in the long term it'll work, but who's out for long term? During this long term, there are too many lives are being lost. If I've settled, let it settle fast.
Are the other people along the street on rent strike as
The
well?
whole district's on rent strike.
I'll go and check anyway.
Right.
Thanks. Goodbye. Do you think this is going to be an effective method of protest?
Well, we hope so. We just hope so. Because we're fighting against a very, very strong government.
Do you think there'll be any evictions or people will try and get the rent?
I couldn't care less, for if there is, I'm quite willing to abide with whatever. It's to help the prisoners. If they do evict us, I don't worry about it. I intend to go ahead with it.
Do you think there'll be trouble if they do try and evict anyone for not paying rent?
Well, I couldn't say that.
John Hume is now trying to get non-violent demonstrations and non-violent protests.
Yes.
Is it possible in Derry these days to have
Well,
a
I trust in
demonstration without violence?
Well, I trust in God. We'll go with whatever John Hume says. Everything he says, we intend to abide by it. Non-violence, by all means.
Do you think he can keep control of the situation?
Well, I'm sure he can, because everyone listened to him. We do really hope and trust in God that there won't be any violence. And we're really hard sorry to think that we're a prisoner. We're Irishmen picked up, put into prison without a trial and beaten up. I think it's really a very cruel method.
Are all the street on
Well, I'm
non-payment?
really sure they are, all are.
Yeah, I'll go and check.
Yes, right.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, all the best now.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Hello.
Hello.
Are you on rent strike here?
We are, yes.
Yeah. You don't intend to pay any rent at all?
No, not to the internees or released.
Do you think that'll be a long time or a short time?
Well, it depends how this campaign goes. If the government have to give in, they'll have to give in and let the internees be released.
Do you think that they'll start evicting people after a long time if they don't pay rent? I mean, they'll have to do something about non-payment of rent, won't they?
Well, the way it is here in Derry, the majority of the people will not pay their rent. So they can't evict everyone. They
Do you think
can
it can be kept up, though?
Well, you know, we don't really know that for sure. We'll have to try it out and see how it ends. But I would say that there will be a certain amount of violence. I mean, the people are definitely, as I said, emotional and have their feelings. And this is the way it is. But the non-violent campaign will definitely be the best way of achieving our ends.
The beauty of the campaign, of course, is that if you don't pay rents and you don't pay arrears, is that it does actually save you money and therefore could be a very effective campaign. How are the government going to counter such a campaign?
There's no beauty in this campaign. It's a dastardly campaign. It's a definite attack, and all that has happened is in the same sort of attack against law and order, against the government of this land. The people here that are doing this have never wanted the Ulster people to prosper and to get on well together or in any other way. And this is just another stage of what one might call their rebellion to try and make certain that Northern Ireland cannot succeed.
Why didn't they want it to prosper?
Because they want this state to fail and be forced to go into, by force or by other means, into an all-Ireland republic.
Protestant fears of a united Ireland were only fuelled this week when the Catholic opposition MPs went to see the Irish Prime Minister, Mr. Lynch, the first time they've ever done so. Hume and his colleagues were there to discuss what help the Irish government could give to the Catholics of the North.
How are you? How are you keeping? Not too bad.
Now that the opposition MPs, with the open support of Mr Lynch, have launched their civil disobedience campaign, the Irish government has become even more dangerously enmeshed in the conflict in Ulster. As the divisions between Catholic and Protestant grow wider, Hume himself can now calmly contemplate the removal of the Stormont government, something that would have been unthinkable to him 2 years ago.
I believe that the right-wing threat is a bluff which the British government should face. They have tried every other solution to this problem down the centuries, and they all have failed. The one thing they have never tried is like de Gaulle with his French Algerians, turning to them and saying, sorry, but your time is up. And I believe the day the British government does that, that's the day we'll begin to have a real solution to this problem, and it will be a peaceful one.
But Ulster gives no hope of peaceful solutions this week as the bombs explode. Even the non-violent campaign of civil disobedience, led by John Hume, can only be seen by Protestants as a violent attack on their state at this stage of Ulster's history. Both sides seem to have come to the conclusion that there are no moderate solutions left.